I love you, she said. She nestled closer, her hand moving up the back of his neck. The wind lifted. Don't kill me, he said. I'm not going to, she said. Actually, that has nothing to do with the story. But here's the Black Tulip. Chapter 1, Mob Vengeance. On the 20th of August, 1672, the city of Hague was crowded in every street with a mob of people, all armed with knives, muskets, or sticks, all hurrying towards the Buitenhof. Within that terrible prison was Cornelius de Witt, brother of John de Witt, the ex-Grand Pensionary of Holland. These brothers de Witt had long served the United Provinces of the Dutch Republic, and the people had grown tired of the Republic, and wanted William, Prince of Orange, for stadtholder. John de Witt had signed the act of re-establishing the stadtholderate, but Cornelius had only signed it under the compulsion of an Orange mob that attacked his house at Dordrecht. This was the first count against the de Witts, with their objection to a stadtholder. The second count was that de Witts had always done their best to keep at peace with France. They knew that war with France meant ruin to Holland, but the more violent Orangists still believed that such a war would bring honor to the Dutch. Hence the popular hatred against the de Witts. A miscreant named Tickleer fanned the flame against Cornelius by declaring that he had bribed him to assassinate William, the newly elected stadtholder. You had a lot of weird words in history here. You really don't need to remember it all to catch the story. And we'll get into the easier part soon, really. But it's, still part of this novel, so. Cornelius was arrested, brought to trial, and tortured on the rack. But no confession of guilt could be wrung from the innocent high-souled man. Then the judges acquitted Tickleer, deprived Cornelius of all his offices, and passed sentence of banishment. John de Witt had already resigned the office of Grand Pensionary. On the 20th of August, Cornelius was to leave his prison for exile, and a fierce Orangist populace incited to violence by the harangues of Tickleer was rushing to the Buitenhof, prepared to do murder and fearful lest the prisoner should escape alive. To the jail! To the jail! Yelled the mob. But outside the prison was a line of cavalry drawn up under the command of Captain Tilly, with orders to guard the Buitenhof, and while the populace stood in hesitation, not daring to attack the soldiers, John de Witt had quietly driven up to the prison and made admitted by the jailer. The shouts and clamor of the people could be heard within the prison of John de Witt. Accompanied by Griffiths, the jailer made his way to his brother's cell. Cornelius learnt there was no time to be lost, but there was a question of certain correspondence between John de Witt and Mademoiselle de la Vue of France to be discussed. These letters, entirely creditable though they were to the statesmanship of the Grand Pensionary, would have been accepted as evidence of treason by the maddened Orangists. Okay, key point. There's some letters that could be established treason. Okay. And Cornelius, instead of burning these letters, had left them in the keeping of his godson, Van Berel, a quiet, scholarly young man of Dordrecht who was utterly unaware of the nature of the pact. They will kill us if these papers are found, said John de Witt, opening the window. They heard the mob shouting, Death to traitors! Death to traitors! Now, in spite of fingers and wrists broken by the rack, Cornelius managed to write a note. Dear godson, burn this packet I gave you. Burn without opening or looking at it so that you may not know the contents. The secrets it contains bring death. Burn it and you would have saved both John and Cornelius. Farewell from your affectionate Cornelius de Witt. Then a letter was given to Crack, John de Witt's faithful servant, who had once set off for Dordrecht, and within a few minutes the two brothers were driving away to the city gate. Rosa, another important point, Rosa, the jailer's daughter, unknown to her father, had opened the postern and had herself bidden de Witt's coachman drive round to the rear of the prison, and by this means the fury of the mob was, for the moment, evaded. And now the clamour of the Orangists was at the prison door, for Tilly's horse had withdrawn on an order signed by the deputies in the town hall, and the people raging to get within the Buitenhof. The mob burst open the great gate, yelling, Death to traitors! To the gallows with Cornelius de Witt! Poured in, only to find the prisoner had escaped. Cornelius escaped. But the escape was but from the prison, for the city gate was locked, and when the carriage of the de Witts drove up, locked by order of the deputies of the town hall, and a certain young man who was none other than William, Prince of Orange, held the key. Before another gate could be reached by the mob, streaming from the Buitenhof, had overtaken the carriage, and the de Witts were at his mercy. The two men whose lives had been spent in the welfare of their country were massacred with unspeakable savagery, and their bodies, stripped and hacked almost beyond recognition, were then strung up on a hastily erected gibbet in the marketplace. When the worst had been done, the young man who had secretly watched the proceedings from the window of a neighboring house returned the key to the gatekeeper. Then the prince mounted a horse with an equerry held in waiting for him and galloped off to camp to wait the message of the states. He galloped proudly, for the burghers of the Hague had made of the corpses of the De Witts a stepping stone to power for the William of Orange. Okay, that was chapter 1 and kind of a lot of actual real-world history that happened in the 1670s. Two guys were brutally murdered, enemies of the state and all that stuff. Okay, now we get into more fun stuff, kind of. Chapter 2, Betrayed. Betrayed for his bulbs. Dr. Cornelius Van Barrel, the godson of Cornelius de Witt, was in his 28th year, an orphan, but nevertheless a really happy man. His father had amassed a fortune of 400,000 guilders in trade with the Indies, and the state brought him in 10,000 guilders a year. He was blessed with the love of a peaceful life, with good nerves, ample wealth, and a philosophic mind. What's a cubit? No, what's a guilder? I don't know what a guilder is. It's a lot of money. Left alone in the big house at Dordrecht, he steadily resisted all temptation of public life. He took up the study of botany, and then, not knowing what to do with his time and his fortune, he decided to go in for one of the most extravagant hobbies of the time, the cultivation of his favorite flower, the tulip. Now, the fame of Mynheer van Barrel's tulips soon spread in the district, and while Cornelius de Witt had roused deadly hatred by sowing the seeds of political passion, Van Barrel with his tulips won general goodwill. And yet, all unknowingly, Dr. Cornelius Van Barrel had made an enemy, an implacable, relentless enemy. This enemy was his neighbor, Isaac Boxtel, who lived next door to him in Dordrecht. Now, Boxtel, from childhood, had been a passionate tulip grower. He'd even produced a tulip of his own, and the Boxtel had won wide admiration. One day, to his horror, Boxtel discovered that his next-door neighbor, the wealthy Mynheer van Barrel, our friend Dr. Cornelius Van Barrel, that is, was also a tulip grower. In bitter anguish, Boxtel foresaw that he had a rival who, with all the resources at his command and a great fortune, might equal and possibly surpass the famous Boxtel tulip creations. Boxtel almost choked with envy, and from the moment of his discovery he lived under continual fear. The healthy pastime of tulip growing became, under these conditions, a morbid and evil occupation for Boxtel, while Van Barrel, on the other hand, totally unaware of the enmity brewing, threw himself into the business with the keenest zest, taking for his motto the old aphorism, "To despise flowers is to insult God." So fierce was the envy that seized Boxtel that though he would have shrunk from the infamy of destroying a tulip, he would have killed the man who grew them. His own plants were neglected. It was useless and hopeless to contend against so wealthy a rival. And then Boxtel, fascinated by his evil passion, bought a telescope, and perched on a ladder, he studied Van Barrel's tulip beds and the drawing room, the tulip grower's sacred place. One night he lost all moral control. He tied the hind legs of 2 cats together with a piece of string, and then he flung the animals into Van Barrel's garden. To Boxtel's bitter mortification, the cats, though they made havoc of many precious plants before they broke the string, left the forest's finest tulips untouched. See, he's an evil man. He even picks on cats and ties their legs together. Shortly afterwards, the Haarlem Tulip Society offered a prize of 100,000 guilders to whomsoever should produce a large black tulip without spot or blemish. Van Barrel at once thought out the idea of the black tulip. He had already achieved a dark brown one, while his envious neighbor Boxtel had only managed to produce a light brown one. Gave up the quest as impossible and could do nothing but spy on his neighbor's activities. One evening, in January of 1672, Cornelius de Witt came to his grandson, Cornelius Van Barrel, and went with him alone into the sacred drawing room, the laboratory of the tulip grower. Isaac Boxtel, with his telescope, recognized the well-known features of the statesman, and presently he saw him hand his godson a packet, which the latter put carefully away in a cabinet. Now, this packet contained the correspondence of John de Witt and Mem de la Vue that we spoke about earlier in the boring part of the chapter 1. Cornelius then drove away, and Boxtel wondered what the packet contained. It could hardly be bulbs. It must be secret papers. Now, it was not until August, as we know, that the crack was dispatched to Van Barrel with a note bidding him destroy the packet. Crack arrived just when Van Barrel was nursing his precious bulbs, the bulbs of the black tulip, and his sudden entrance rudely disturbed our tulip grower. He had not time to read the note. Indeed, he was too much concerned with the welfare of his 3 particular bulbs to trouble about it. He knew that his godfather was dead, and that was enough. He didn't have time to read a note. He was playing with his tulips. And before a magistrate and some soldiers then entered to arrest Van Barrel. Van Barrel wrapped up the bulbs and the note from his godfather, and was sent off under close custody to The Hague. The magistrate carried off the packet from the cabinet. Now all this was Boxtel's work. It was he who had reported to the magistrate the visit of De Witt and the placing of the packet in a cabinet. And now, with Van Barrel out of the house as a prisoner, Isaac Boxtel in the dead of night broke into his neighbour's house to secure the priceless bulbs of the black tulip. He'd made out where they were growing. He plunged his hands into the soft soil only to find nothing. Then the wretched man guessed that the bulbs had gone with the prisoner to The Hague and decided to go in pursuit. Van Barrel could only keep them while he was alive, and then they should be his, Isaac Boxtel's. Chapter 3. The Theft of the Tulip. Van Barrel was placed in the cell occupied by Cornelius de Witt in the Buitenhof jail. Outside in the marketplace, the bodies of the de Witts were still hanging, and Van Barrel read with horror the inscription, "Here hang that great rascal John de Witt and little rascal Cornelius de Witt, enemies of their country." Griffiths laughed, and when the prisoner asked him what it meant, replied, "That's what happens to those that write secret letters to the enemies of the Prince of Orange." A terrible despair fell on Van Barrel, but he refused to escape when Rosa, the jailer's beautiful daughter, suggested it to him. He was brought to trial, and though he denied all knowledge of the correspondence, his goods were confiscated and he was condemned to death. He bequeathed his 3 black tulip bulbs to Rosa, the jailer's daughter, and explained how she must get a certain soil from Dordrecht, and went out calmly to die. On the scaffold, Cornelius Van Barrel was reprieved and sentenced to perpetual imprisonment instead of immediate death, for the Prince of Orange shrank from further bloodshed. One spectator in the crowd was bitterly disappointed. This was Isaac Boxtel, the idiot neighbor, who had bribed the headsman to let him have Van Barrel's clothes, believing that he would thus obtain the priceless bulbs. Van Barrel was sent to the prison of Lowenstein, and in February 1673, when he was thinking his tulips lost forever, he heard Rosa's voice. Griffiths had applied for the jailership of Lowenstein and had been appointed. Nothing could persuade him that if Van Barrel was not a traitor, he was certainly in league with the devil like all learned men, and he did all he could to mortify and annoy his prisoner. But Rosa would come every night when her father, stupefied by gin, was asleep, and talk to Cornelius through the barred grating of his cell door. Cornelius taught Rosa to read, and together they planned how the tulip bulbs should be brought to flower. One bulb Rosa was to plant, the second Van Barrel would cultivate in his cell, with the soil placed in an old water jug, and the third was to be kept in secret reserve. Once more hope revived in Van Barrel's mind, but Rosa often suffered vexation because Cornelius thought more of his black tulip than he did of her. In the meantime, Isaac Boxtel, under the assumed name of Jacob Gissels, had made his way to Lowenstein in pursuit of the bulbs, and ingratiated himself with Griffiths, offering to marry his daughter. Rosa's tulips had to be guarded from the Gissels, who was always spying on her movements. She kept it in her room for safety, but Boxtel had a key made, and the day the tulip flowered and arose a spotless black flower, he resolved to take it at once and rush to Haarlem and claim the prize. The day came. Rosa described to Cornelius the wonderful black tulip. They drew up a letter to the president of the Horticultural Society at Haarlem, begging him to come and fetch the wonderful flower. That very night, while Cornelius and Rosa rejoiced as lovers, for now even Rosa was convinced of the prisoner's love for her, over the happiness of the flowering tulip, Isaac Boxtel crept into a room and carried off the black tulip to Haarlem. Now as for Van Barrel, he was beside himself with the rage of desperation when Rosa told him that the black tulip had been stolen. Rosa, bent on recovering the tulip and certain in her own mind as to the thief, hastened away from Lowenstein the next day without a word. Griffiths was mad when he learnt his daughter was nowhere to be found, and put down the mysterious disappearance of Jacob, Gissels, and Rosa to the work of the devil, and was convinced that Van Barrel was the devil's agent. The third day after the theft, Griffiths, armed with a stick and a knife, attacked Cornelius, calling out, "Give me back my daughter, you there!" Cornelius got hold of the stick, forced Griffiths to drop the knife, and then proceeded to give the jailer a thrashing. The noise brought in turnkeys and guards, who speedily carried off the wounded jailer and arrested Van Barrow. To comfort the prisoner, they assured him he would certainly be shot within 12 hours. Yes, that is a great comfort, isn't it? And then an officer, an aide-de-camp of the Prince of Orange, entered, escorted Van Barrow to the prison gate, and bade him enter a carriage. Believing himself about to die, Cornelius thought sadly of Rosa, and at the end of the Tulip he was never to see again. The carriage rolled off. They all travelled all that day and night until the journey ended at Haarlem. Chapter 4. The Triumph of the Tulip. Rosa reached Haarlem just 4 hours after Boxtel's arrival, and she went at once to seek an interview with Mynheer van Sistens, the president of the Horticultural Society. Immediate admittance was granted on her mentioning the magic words Black Tulip. "Sir, the Black Tulip has been stolen from me," said Rosa. "But I just saw it 2 hours ago," replied the president. "You saw it? Where?" "Why, at your master's. Are you not in the service of Mynheer Isaac Boxtel?" "I, sir? Certainly not. But that this Isaac Boxtel, he is a thin, bald-headed, bow-legged, crook-backed, haggard-looking man." "Yes, you've described him exactly." "He, sir, is the thief. He stole the Black Tulip from me." "Well, I suggest you go and find Mynheer Boxtel. He's at the White Swan Inn, and you settle it with him." And with that, the president of the Horticultural Society took up his pen and went on writing, or he was busy over his report. But Rosa still implored him, and while she was speaking, the Prince of Orange entered the building. Rosa told everything, how she had received the bulb from the prisoner at Lowenstein, and how she had first seen the prisoner at the Hague. Then Boxtel was sent for, but he was ready with his tale. The girl had plotted with her lover, the state prisoner Cornelius Van Barrow, and had stolen his, Boxtel's, Black Tulip, he said, which he had unwisely mentioned. However, he had recovered it. A thought struck Rosa. "Sir Boxtel, there were 3 tulip bulbs. What has become of the others?" I say, one of them failed. The second produced this black tulip. The third is, I've left my home in Dordrecht," said Boxtel. "You lie. It is here," cried Rosa, and she drew from her bosom the third bulb, still wrapped in the same paper Van Barrow had so hastily put around the bulbs on his flight. "Take it, my lord," she said, handing it to the prince. And then, glancing at the paper for the first time, she added, "Oh, my lord, read this." William passed the third bulb to the president, read the paper carefully. It was Cornelius de Witt's letter to his godson, exhorting him to burn the packet without opening it. It was proof of Van Barrow's innocence and of his ownership of the black tulip bulbs. "Go, Mynheer Boxtel. You shall have justice. And you, Mynheer van Sistens, take care of this maiden and of the tulip, and for God's sake stop playing with all those post-its on your desk," said the prince. That same evening, the prince summoned Rosa to the town hall and talked to her. Rosa did not deny her love for Cornelius. "But what good is it, the loving of a man condemned to live and die in prison?" the prince asked. "I can't help him to live and then die," came the answer. The prince sealed a letter and sent it off to Lowenstein by Colonel Van Decken. Then he turned to Rosa and said, "The day after tomorrow is Sunday. It will be the festival of the tulip. Take these 500 guilders and dress yourself in the costume of a Friesland bride, for I want it to be a grand festival for you." Sunday came, May 15th, 1673, and all Haarlem gathered to do honor to the black tulip. Boxtel was in the crowd, feasting his eyes on the sacred flower, which was borne aloft in a litter. The procession stopped, and the flower was placed on a pedestal, while the people cheered with wild enthusiasm. At the solemn moment when the Prince of Orange was to claim the triumphant owner of the black tulip and present the prize of 100,000 guilders, the coach with the unhappy prisoner Cornelius Van Barrow drew up in the marketplace. Cornelius, believing himself still condemned to death and hearing that the celebration of the black tulip was actually proceeding, besought his guard to let him have one final glimpse of his flower, and the petition was granted by the Prince of Orange. From a distance of 6 paces, Van Barrow gazed at the black tulip. Then he, with the multitude, turned his eyes toward the prince. In dead silence, the prince declared that the occasion of the festival, the discovery of the wonderful black tulip, and concluded, "Let the owner of the black tulip approach." Cornelius made an involuntary movement. Boxtel and Rosa rushed forward from the crowd. The prince turned to Rosa. "This tulip My lady, is yours, is it not?
Yes, my lord,
she answered softly, and general applause came from the crowd. This tulip, then, will henceforth bear the name of its producer and be called Tulipa Nigra Rosa Bertensis, because Van Beryl is to be married, name of this damsel, the prince announced. And at the same time he took Rosa's hand, he placed it within the hand of the prisoner who had rushed forward at the words he had heard. Boxtel fell down in a fit. When they raised him up, he was dead. Good riddance. The procession returned to the town hall. The prince declared Rosa the prize winner and informed Cornelius that having been wrongfully condemned, his property was restored to him. Then he entered his coach and was driven away. Cornelius and Rosa departed for Dordrecht, and Van Barrow remained ever faithful to his wife and his tulips. And as for old Griffiths, the jail keeper, after being the roughest jailer of men, he lived to be the fiercest guardian of the tulips at Dordrecht.
So, happy ending?
Probably so. And believe you me, that is a long, 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 long book. If you're a real history aficionado, you will enjoy reading the full version. If not, then I hope you got a taste of it from this one. Anyway, now we have Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Charlotte Bronte was one of the novelist daughters of Irish churchman Patrick Bronte. She has many poems and stories to her credit, including Emma and Jane Eyre. There have been dozens of TV, stage, and ballet versions of tonight's story, Jane Eyre. This story also inspired Daphne du Maurier's story, Rebecca. Right, Jilly? The 1940s movie I Walked with a Zombie, and Jean Rice's The Wide Sargasso Sea. Wait a minute. Am I telling you that our two authors tonight wrote books about vampires and zombies? And here we are reading their romance stories? I know. Stunning, isn't it? It is, after all, February. Jane Eyre was orphaned as a child and has felt an outcast her whole young life. Her courage is tested once again when she arrives at Thornfield Hall, which has been hired by the brooding, proud Edward Rochester to care for his ward Adele. Jane finds herself drawn to this troubled yet kind spirit, and she falls in love. Hard. But there's a terrifying secret in the gloomy, forbidding Thornfield Hall. What is Rochester hiding from Jane? Will Jane be left heartbroken and exiled once again? Let's read on, shall we? What? That doesn't seem likely. 1 minute, please. I don't know. It still look like it's working on this end. Mr. Corrigan, thank you. I don't know. Sorry, it looks like we had a technical difficulty, but I can't see anything I can do to fix it. So, onward. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a zombie in possession of brains must be in want of more brains. That's not the right book. Oh, Jane Eyre, here we go. Chapter 1. Thornfield, my new home after I left school, was, I found, a fine old battlemented hall. And Mrs. Fairfax, who had answered my advertisement, a mild elderly lady, related by marriage to Mr. Rochester, the owner of the estate and guardian of Adela Verins, my little pupil. It was not until 3 months after my arrival there that my adventures began. One day Mrs. Fairfax proposed to show me over the house, much of which was unoccupied. The third story especially had the aspect of a home of the past, a shrine of memory. I liked its hush and its quaintness. If there were a ghost at Thornfield Hall, this would be its haunt indeed, said Mrs. Fairfax as we passed the range of apartments on our way to see the view from the roof. I was pacing through the corridor of the third floor on my return, when the last sound I expected in so still a region struck my ear. A laugh, distinct, formal, mirthless. At first it was very low, but it passed off in a clamorous peal that seemed to wake an echo in every lonely chamber. Mrs. Fairfax, I called out, did you hear that cackle, that laugh? Who is it?
Oh, it's some of the servants, very likely, she answered. Perhaps Gracie Poole.
The laugh was repeated in a low tone and terminated in an odd murmur.
Gracie!
Exclaimed Mrs. Fairfax. I didn't expect Gracie to answer, for the laugh was preternatural. Nevertheless, the door nearest me opened. A servant came out, a set, square-made figure with a hard, plain face.
Too much noise, Gracie, said Mrs. Fairfax. Remember directions.
Gracie curtsied silently and went in. Now, not infrequently after that, I heard Gracie Poole's laugh, and her eccentric murmurs stranger than her laugh. Late one fine, calm afternoon in January, I volunteered to carry to the post at Hay, 2 miles distant, a letter Mrs. Fairfax had just written. The lane to Hay inclined uphill all the way, and having reached the middle, I sat on a stile till the sun went down, and on the hilltop above me stood the rising moon. The village was a mile distant, but in the absolute hush I could hear plainly its murmurs of life. A rude noise broke on the fine ripplings and whisperings of the evening calm. A metallic clatter. A horse was coming. A horse. The windings of the lane hid as it approached, and then I heard a rush under the hedge, and close by glided a great dog, not staying to look up. The horse followed, a tall steed, and on his back a rider. He passed, a sliding sound, a clattering tumble, and the man and the horse were down. They had slipped on the sheet of ice which glazed the causeway. The dog came bounding back, sniffed round the prostrate group, and then ran up to me. It was all he could do. I obeyed him, and I walked down to the traveller, struggling himself free of his steed. I think he was swearing, but I'm not certain. "Can I do anything?" I asked. "Yeah, you can stand one side," he answered as he rose, whereupon being and a heaving, stamping process, accompanied by barking and baying, and the horse was re-established and the dog silenced with a "Down, Pilot, down!" "If you are hurt and want help, sir," I remarked, "I can fetch someone, either from Thornfield Hall or from Hay." "Thank you, I shall do. I have no broken bones, only a sprain," and he limped into the stile. This man had a dark face with stern features, a heavy brow. His eyes and gathered eyebrows looked ireful and thwarted. He was past youth, but had not reached middle age. Perhaps he might be 35. I felt no fear of him, but a little shyness. His frown and his roughness set me at ease. He waved me to go, but I said, "I cannot think of leaving you in this solitary lane till you are fit to mount your horse, sir." "Well, you ought to be at your home yourself. Where do you come from?" "From just below." "You mean the house of the battlements down there?" "Yes, sir." "Whose house is it?" "Mr. Rochester's." "Do you know Mr. Rochester?" "No, I've never seen him." "No. You're not a servant at the hall, of course. You are,
"I am the governess."
"Ah, the governess. Deuce take me if I'd forgotten. Excuse me," he continued. "Necessity compels me to make you useful." He laid a hand on my shoulder. He limped to his horse. He caught the bridle, and grimacing grimly, he sprang into the saddle with a "thank you" and bounded away. When I returned from Hay after posting Mrs. Fairfax's letter, I went to her room. She was not there, but sitting upright on the rug was the great black and white long-haired dog. I went forward and said, "Pilot!" And the thing got up and came to me, sniffed me, wagged his great tail, and I rang the bell. "Whose dog is this?" "Oh, he came with the master, who has just arrived. He's had an accident and his ankle is sprained." The next day I was summoned to take tea with Mr. Rochester and my pupil. When I entered, he was looking at Adele, who knelt on the hearth beside Pilot. "Here is Miss Eyre, sir," said Mrs. Fairfax in her quiet way. Mr. Rochester bowed, still not taking his eyes from the group of the dog and the child. I sat down, disembarrassed. Politeness might have confused me. Caprice led me under no obligation. Mrs. Fairfax seemed to think someone should be amiable, and she began to talk. "Madam, I should like some tea," was the sole rejoinder she got. "Come to the fire," said the master, when the tray was taken away. "When you came on me in Hay Lane last night, I thought unaccountably of fairy tales, and I had half a mind to demand whether you had bewitched my horse." "I'm not sure yet." "Who are your parents?" "I have none, sir." I thought not. And so you're waiting for your people when you sat on that stile?"
For whom, sir?"
"For your people. The men in green. Did I break through one of your rings that spread that ice on the causeway?"
No."
I shook my head. "Yes, the men in green all forsook England 100 years ago. I don't think either
There's summer harvest or winter moon will ever shine in their revels more.
Mrs. Fairfax dropped her knitting, wondering what sort of talk this was, and remarked that Miss Eyre had been a kind and careful teacher.
Bah, don't trouble yourself to give her a character, returned Mr. Rochester. I shall judge for myself. She began by following my horse.
You said Mr. Rochester was not peculiar, Mrs. Fairfax, I remonstrated, and when I joined her in her room after putting Adele to bed. After a time, my master's manner towards me changed. It became more uniform. I never seemed in his way. He did not take fits of chilling hauteur. When he met me, the encounter seemed welcome. He always had a word and sometimes a smile for me. I felt at times as if he were my relation rather than my master, and so happy did I become that the blanks of existence were filled up. He had now been resident 8 weeks, though Mrs. Fairfax said he seldom stayed at the Hall longer than a fortnight. And one night, I hardly know whether I had been sleeping or musing, I started wide awake on hearing a vague murmur, peculiar and lugubrious. It ceased, but my heart beat anxiously. My inward tranquillity was broken. The clock far down in the hall struck 2. Just then my chamber door was touched as if fingers swept the panels, groping away along the dark gallery outside. I was chilled with fear, and then I remembered that it might be Pilot, and the idea calmed me, but it was fated that I should not sleep that night. For the very keyhole of my chamber, as it seemed, a demoniac laugh was uttered. My first impulse was to rise and fasten the bolt, my next to cry, "Who's there?" Ere long, steps retreated up the gallery toward the 3rd-floor staircase. Then all was still. Was it Gracie Poole? I thought to myself. On the 3rd floor? I hurried on my frock, with a trembling hand, opened the door. And there, burning outside, left in the matting of the gallery, was a candle. The air was filled with smoke, which rushed in a cloud from Mr. Rochester's room. In an instant I was within the chamber. Tongues of fire darted around the bed. The curtains were on fire, and in the midst of it all lay Mr. Rochester in deep sleep. I shook him, but he seemed stupefied. Then I rushed to his basin and ewer, and I deluged the bed with water. He woke with a cry. "Oh, is there a flood? What is it? What is it?" I briefly related what had transpired. He was now in his dressing gown, and warning me to stay where I was and call no one, he added, "I must pay a visit to the 3rd floor." A long time elapsed ere he returned, pale and gloomy. "I found it all out," he said. "It is as I thought. You are no talking fool. Say nothing about it. You hear me? Nothing." He held out his hand as we parted. I gave him mine. He took it in both his own. "You've saved my life. I have a pleasure in owing you since so immense a debt. I feel your benefits no burden, Jane." Strange energy was in his voice, strange fire in his look. Till morning I was tossed on a buoyant but unquiet sea. In the morning I heard the servants exclaim how providential that master thought of the water jug when he had left the candle alight. In passing the room I saw sewing rings on the new curtains, no other than Gracie Poole. Company now came to the hall, including the beautiful Miss Ingram, who rumor associated with Mr. Rochester, as I heard from Mrs. Fairfax. One day Mr. Rochester had been called away from home, and on his return, as I was his first intimate of the house to meet him, I remarked, "Oh, are you aware, Mr. Rochester, the stranger has arrived since you left this morning?" "A stranger? No, I expected no one. Did he give you his name?" "His name is Mason, sir. Mason, and he comes from the West Indies." Mr. Rochester was standing near me, and as I spoke he gave my wrist a convulsive grip while a spasm caught his breath, and he turned whiter than ashes. "Do you feel ill, sir?" Jane, I've got a blow. I've got a blow, Jane." He staggered. Then he sat down and made me sit beside him. My little friend," said he to me, "I wish I were in a quiet island with only you, when trouble and danger and hideous recollections were removed from me." Can I help you, sir? I'd give my life to serve you, sir." "Jane, if aid is wanted, I will seek it at your hands." "Thank you, sir. Tell me what to do." "Go back into the room. Step up quietly to Mason. Tell him Mr. Rochester has come and wishes to see him. Show him in here, and then leave me." So at a late hour that night I heard the visitors repair to their chamber, Mr. Rochester saying, "This way, Mason. This is your room." He spoke cheerfully, and the gay tones set my heart at ease. Then, awakening in the dead of night, I stretched my hand to draw the curtain, for the moon was full and bright. And then, good God, what a cry! The night was rent in twain by a savage, shrilly sound that ran from the end to end of Thornfield Hall. The cry died and was not renewed. Indeed, whatever being uttered that fearful shriek under the full of the moon could not soon repeat it. Not the widest-winged condor from the Andes could twice in succession send out such a yell from the clouds shrouding his Eyre. And it came. That hideous scream came out of the third story. And overheard, yes, in that room just above my chamber, I heard a deadly struggle, a half-smothered voice shout, "Help! Help! Help! Help!" The chamber door opened. Someone rushed along the gallery. Another step stamped on the floor above, and something fell. Then there was silence. The sleepers were all aroused and gathered in the gallery, which but for the moonlight would have been in complete darkness. The door at the end of the gallery opened, and Mr. Rochester advanced with a candle. He just descended from the upper story. All right, he cried. "A servant has had a nightmare, that's all, and has taken a fit with fright. Now I must see you all back to your rooms." And so by dint of coaxing and commanding, he contrived to get them back to their dormitories. I retreated unnoticed, and I dressed myself carefully to be ready for emergencies. About an hour passed, and then a cautious hand tapped low at my door. Jane, are you up and dressed?" "Yes." "Then come out quietly." Mr. Rochester stood in the gallery holding a light. "Bring a sponge and some volatile salts," said he. I did so and followed. "Jane, you don't turn sick at the sight of blood, do you?" I think not. I've never been tried yet." We entered a room with an inner apartment, from whence a snarling, snatching sound. Mr. Rochester went forward into this apartment, and a shout of laughter greeted his entrance. Gracie Poole then was there. When he came out, he closed the door behind him. "Here, Jane, here." I walked round to the other side of the large bed in the outer room, and there, in an easy-chair, his head leaned back, I recognized the pale and seemingly lifeless face of the stranger, Mason. His linen on one side and one arm was almost soaked in blood. Mr. Rochester took the sponge, dipped it in water, moistened the corpse-like face, and applied my smelling bottle to the nostrils. Mr. Mason unclosed his eyes and murmured, "Is there an immediate danger?" "May a scratch. I'll fetch a surgeon now. You'll be removed by the morning. Jane, you'll sponge the blood when he returns. Put your salts to his nose. You'll not speak to him on any pretext. And Richard, it will be at the peril of your life if you speak to her. You understand me both." 2 hours later, the surgeon came and removed the injured man. In the morning, I heard Rochester in the yard saying to some of the visitors, "Mason got the start of you all this morning. He's gone before sunrise. I rose to see him off." A splendid midsummer shone over England then. In the sweetest hour of 24, after the sun had gone down in simple state, the dew fell cool on the panting plain. I had walked into the orchard to the giant horse-chestnut near the sunk fence that separates the hall grounds from the lonely fields, when there came to me the warning fragrance of Mr. Rochester's cigar. I was about to retreat when he intercepted me and said, "Turn back, Jane. On so lovely a night it is a shame to sit in the house." I did not like to walk alone with my master at this hour in the shadowy orchard, but I could find no reason for leaving him. "Jane," he recommenced, as we slowly strayed down in the direction of the horse-chestnut, "Thornfield is a pleasant place in the summer, is it not?" "Oh, yes, sir." "You must have become in some degree attached to it?" "Oh, I am attached to it indeed, sir." "That's a pity," he said, and paused. "Oh, must I move on then, sir?" I asked him. Yes, I believe you must, Jane." Now this was a blow, but I did not let it prostrate me. "Then, and you're going to be married, sir?" "In about a month I hope to be a bridegroom. We've been good friends, Jane, have we not?" "Yes, sir." "Here's the chestnut tree. Come, we'll sit here in peace tonight." He seated me and himself. "Jane, do you hear the nightingales singing in the woods? Listen." In listening, I sobbed convulsively, for I could repress what I endured no longer, and when I did speak, it was only to express an impetuous wish that I had never been born or never come to Thornfield. "Because you're sorry to leave it?" he asked me. The vehemence of emotion was claiming mastery and struggling for full sway to overcome, to live, to rise and reign at last, and yes, even to speak. "I grieve to leave Thornfield. I love Thornfield, sir, because I have lived in it a full and delightful life. I have not been trampled upon. I have not been petrified. I have talked face to face with what I delight in, an original, vigorous, and expanded mind. I have known you, Mr. Rochester. I see the necessity of departure, but it's like looking at the necessity of death."
Where do you see the necessity? He asked suddenly.
Do you think I can stay to become nothing to you? I retorted, roused to something like passion. Do you think because I am poor, obscure, plain, and little, that I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong, sir. I have as much soul as you, and full as much heart. I am not talking to you now through the medium of custom, conventionalities, or even mortal flesh. It is my spirit, sir, that addresses your spirit, just as if both had passed to the grave and we stood at God's feet equal, as we are. As we are.
Yes, as we are, repeated Mr. Rochester, gathering me to his heart and pressing his lips on my lips. And so, Jane?
Yes, so, sir, I replied. I have spoken my mind and can go anywhere now. Let me go.
Jane, be still. Don't struggle so, like a wild, frantic bird rending its own plumage in its desperation.
I am no bird, and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will, which I now exert to leave you.
Another effort set me at liberty, and I stood erect before him. And your will shall decide your destiny. I offer you my hand, Jane. I offer you my hand, my heart, and a share in all my possessions.
A waft of wind came sweeping down the laurel walk and trembled through the boughs of the chestnut. It wandered away to an infinite distance, and it died. The nightingale's song was then the only voice of the hour, and listening to it again I wept. Mr. Rochester sat looking at me gently, and at last said, drawing me to him again,
My bride is here, because my equal is here, and my likeness. Jane, will you marry me? Give me my name, Edward. Say, I will marry you.
Are you in earnest? Do you love me? Do you sincerely wish me to be your wife?
I do, I swear it.
Then, sir, I will marry you.
God pardon me, and man meddle not with me. I have her, and I will hold her.
But what had befallen the night? And what ailed the chestnut tree? It writhed and groaned, while the wind roared in the laurel walk.
We must go in, said Mr. Rochester. The weather changes.
He hurried me up the path, but we were wet before I could pass through the threshold. There were no groomsmen, no bridesmaids, no relatives to wait for or marshal, none but Mr. Rochester and I. I wonder what other bridegroom looked as he did, so bent up to a purpose, so resolutely grim. Our place was taken at the communion rails. All was still. 2 shadows only moved in a remote corner of the church. The clergyman's lips unclosed to ask, Wilt thou have this woman for thy wedded wife? A distant and near voice said, The marriage cannot go on. I declare the existence of an impediment. What is the nature of the impediment? Asked the clergyman. It simply consists in the existence of a previous marriage, said the speaker. Mr. Rochester has a wife now alive, living. My nerves vibrated at those low-spoken words as they had never vibrated to thunder. I looked at Mr. Rochester. I made him look at me. His face was colourless rock, his eye both spark and flint. He seemed as if he would defy all things. Mr. Mason, have the goodness to step forward, said the stranger. Are you aware, sir, whether or not this gentleman's wife is still living? Inquired the clergyman. She is now alive and living at Thornfield Hall, said Mason with white lips. I saw her there last April. I am her brother. I saw a grim smile contract Mr. Rochester's lips. Enough, said he. Wood, to the clergyman, close your book. John Green, to the clerk, leave the church. There'll be no wedding this day. Bigamy is an ugly word, Mr. Rochester continued. But I meant to be a bigamist. This girl thought all was fair and legal and never dreamt she was going to be entrapped into a feigned union with a defrauded wretch already bound to a bad, mad, and imbruted partner. Follow me. I invite you all to visit Gracie Poole's patient and my wife. Yes, my wife. And so we passed up to the 3rd story, and there in the deep shade of the inner room beyond the room where I had watched over the wounded Mason, ran backward and forward, seemingly on all fours, a figure, whether beast or human, or one could not at first sight tell. This thing snatched and growled like some wild animal. It was covered with clothing, but a quantity of dark grizzled hair, wild as a mane, hid its head and face.
Yes, that is my wife, said Mr. Rochester, whom I was cheated into marrying 15 years ago. A mad woman and a drunkard, a family of idiots and maniacs for 3 generations, and this is what I wish to have, laying his hand upon my shoulder, this young girl who stands so grave and quiet at the mouth of hell. Jane, Jane, I never meant to wound you thus.
Now, dear listener, I forgave him at the moment, on the spot. I forgave him all, yet not in words, not outwardly, only at my heart's core. That night I never thought to sleep, but a slumber fell on me as soon as I lay down in bed, and in my sleep a vision broke to my spirit. Daughter, flee temptation. I rose at the dim dawn. One word comprised my intolerable duty. Depart. So, after 3 days wandering and starvation on the North Midland moors, for hastily and secretly I had travelled by coach as far from Thornfield as my money could carry me, I found a temporary home at the vicarage of Morton, until the clergyman of that moorland parish, Mr. St. John Rivers, secured for me, under the assumed name of Jane Elliot, the mistress-ship of the village school. At Christmas I left the school. As the spring advanced, St. John Rivers, who with an icy heroism was possessed by the idea of becoming a missionary, urged me strongly to accompany him to India as his wife, on the grounds that I was docile, diligent, and courageous, and would be very useful to him. I felt such veneration for him that I was tempted to cease struggling with him, to rush down the torrent of his will into the gulf of his existence, and there lose my own. But then the time came when he called on me to decide. I fervently longed to do what was right, and only that. Show me the path. Show me the path, I entreated of heaven. My heart beat fast and thick. I heard its throb. Suddenly it stood still to an inexpressible feeling that it thrilled it through. My senses rose expectant. Ear and eye waited. While the flesh quivered on my bones, I saw nothing, but I heard a voice. I heard a voice somewhere cry, Jane, 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 and nothing more. Oh, God, what is it? What is it? I gasped. I might have said, where is it? For it did not seem in the room, nor in the house, nor in the garden, nor from overhead. It was the voice of a human being, a loved, well-remembered voice. The voice of Edward Fairfax Rochester, and it spoke in pain and woe, wildly, eerily, urgently. I am coming, I cried. Wait for me. And I ran out in the garden. It was void. Down, superstition, I commented, as that spectre rose up black by the black yew at the gate. I mounted to my chamber. I locked myself in. I fell on my knees, and I seemed to penetrate a very near mighty spirit, and my soul rushed out in gratitude at his feet. Then I rose from the thanksgiving. I took a resolve. I lay down unscared, enlightened now, eager, but for the daylight. 36 hours later, I was crossing the fields to where I could see the full front of my master's mansion, and looking with a timorous joy, I saw a blackened ruin. Where, meantime, was the hapless owner? I returned to the inn where the host himself, a respectable middle-aged man, brought my breakfast into the parlor. I scarcely knew how to begin my questions. Is Mr. Rochester living at Thornfield Hall now? Oh, no, ma'am, no. No one's living up there. It was burnt down at harvest time. The fire broke out at dead of night. Was it known how it originated? Well, they guessed, ma'am, they guessed. There was a lady, you see, a lunatic kept in that house. Yes, she's a lunatic. She had a woman to take care of her called her Mrs. Poole, an able woman, but for one fault, she kept a private bottle of gin by her, she did, and the mad lady would take the keys out of her pocket and let herself out of the chamber and go roaming about the house, doing any wild mischief that came into her head. Well, her keeper there laid snuggerated him. Mr. Rochester was at home when the fire broke out, and he went up to the attics and got the servants out of their beds, and then went back to get his mad wife out of her cell. And then they called out to him that she was up on the roof, and there she was waving her arms and shouting till they could hear her a mile off. Oh, she's a big woman now, yes. She's a big woman. She had long black hair. We could see it streaming against the flames as she stood. We saw Mr. Rochester approach her and call out, Bertha! And then, ma'am, she wailed and she gave a spring, and the next minute she lay dead, smashed on the pavement. Were any other lives lost?
No, no, no. Perhaps it would have been better if they had. Oh, poor Mr. Edward, he's stone blind now. Stone blind he is.
I dreaded that he was mad.
As he came down the great staircase, it fell, and he was taken out of the ruins with one eye knocked out and one hand so crushed the surgeon had to amputate directly the other eye. His other eye, poor thing. He lost sight of that also, all inflamed and whatnot.
Well, where does he live now, sir?
Live? Oh, well. He's over at Ferndane, a manor house over on the farm he has. Quite a desolate spot, ask me. Old John and his wife are with him, and he would have none else.
And so, to Ferndane I came just ere dusk, walking the last mile. As I approached, the narrow front door of the grange slowly opened, and a figure came out of the twilight, a man without a hat. He stretched forth his hand to feel whether it rained. It was my master, Edward Fairfax Rochester. He groped his way back to the house, and re-entering it, closed the door. I now drew near and knocked, and John's wife opened it for me. "Mary," I said, "how are you?" Mary started as if she had seen a ghost. I calmed her and followed her into the kitchen. When I explained in a few words that I should stay for the night and that John must fetch my trunk from the turnpike house. At this moment the parlour bell rang. Mary proceeded to fill a glass with water and place it on a tray, together with candles. "Give the tray to me, Mary. I'll carry it in." The old dog Pilot pricked up his ears as I entered the room, and then he jumped up with a yelp and bounded towards me, almost knocking the tray from my hands.
What's the matter? What's the matter?
Inquired Mr. Rochester. He put out his hand with a quick gesture.
Who is this?
He demanded imperiously. "Will you have a little more water, sir? I spilled half of what was in the glass."
"What is it? Who speaks to me? Who speaks?"
"Pilot knows me. John and Mary know I am here." He groped, and resting his wandering hand, I prisoned it in both mine. Ah, her very fingers, her small slight fingers. "Is it Jane? Jane Eyre?" "My dear master, I am Jane Eyre. I have found you out, and I am come back to you. Listener, I married him."
And so, another happy ending. I am losing my edge here. I think we better do some ghost stories next week.